Good afternoon. Good afternoon. We're glad to see all of you here today, and welcome to our virtual participants as well. I know that many of the Smithsonian affiliates are joining us this afternoon, as well as international museums, so we're glad to have you with us. This is part of the Good Lecture Series, and for people at the Smithsonian, I know you all know Good. He is one of the first people at the Smithsonian to make education his leading charge. And while he was at what was then the National American Museum and later became the Arts and Industries Building, he always put education first, although he was also a scholar as well. And this series is part of that tradition. I want to thank Pino Monaco. Pino, would you? Many of you have already met Pino. Pino is in our office, and we're proud to have someone who is looking at evaluation in the office, and I know he has visited many of the education units already, and if he hasn't, he will be visiting you. And so he is the one who has put together this series for this year. And the focus of the series, the two lectures that we'll have this year, are forces that are shaping museums. And so today what we're going to look at is one of those forces, an important force for us, and that's technology. It's my pleasure to introduce someone who is leading us in those efforts, and that's someone that I know you all know as well, and that's Ann Spire. And Ann is officially our Chief Information Officer, but in reality probably our Chief Innovation Officer. And she's bringing a great many changes to this institution, which are bringing us to a larger audience in a closer way. And with that, I'd like to introduce Ann.
Thank you, Stephanie. It's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Maxwell Anderson, our distinguished speaker, and his lecture is Through the Looking Glass, Museums and Internet-Based Transparency, and he will discuss how museums can adapt to the potential of social computing and how the old school website that's focused on facilitating physical access and rudimentary collections information is fast becoming a necessity, but it's insufficient really for the front door of museums online today. His lecture is particularly timely as we at the Smithsonian look both inward and outward through our larger strategic planning process that Wayne talked about this morning in his presentation. And we also have a number of strategic planning processes going on with web strategy and digitization, being led by Mike Edson on web and Kathy Spies on digitization. And we're really at a state right now where we're grappling with how to remain relevant in a changing world. And we're not the only ones that are doing this today. If you look around in the broader community and across the world, there's news media, there's universities, there's Hollywood, and yes, even the federal government, as we know. is trying to figure out how to grapple with these challenges. But also with challenges comes opportunity. And we've got the opportunity now to engage our virtual and our physical visitors in a much richer manner than we have in the past. These visitors want to be involved and they want deeper participation than what has primarily been a passive interaction with us. Today, practices of scholarship are changing in profound and wide-reaching ways. It's driven by technology that's connecting people to people across organizations and remotely connecting researchers to their data collection devices. And one of the questions we and other cultural institutions have to address is the desires of this group known as digital natives. They're now entering the workforce. And they think WWW stands for whatever, whenever, and wherever. These natives grew up with technology as an integral part of their daily life, and they choose to get their information online. They think and process information fundamentally different than we do. This group would rather text message than talk on the phone. They'd rather talk on the phone than have a meeting in person. And they don't even use email. They use Facebook and MySpace and Twitter and other social networking sites to communicate today. On their own initiative, many of our staff have begun putting the Smithsonian on social networking sites and going to where our visitors choose to get their experiences rather than forcing our visitors to come to our websites. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of those real quick. One is a webcam that was temporarily installed to capture visitors eating art at Sam's President's Day weekend cupcake art installation. The broadcast generated 15,000 viewers each day and drew physical visitors who said they came because of the webcast that they saw. And at the same time, our Smithsonian Twitter membership grew by 20% after this one event. So that's really the power of social networking. Last June, the Smithsonian also joined the Flickr Commons. Many of you were involved in that project, as it was the first pan-institutional collaboration in a social networking space. And as a result, the Smithsonian Library's Portraits of Scientists photographs of 19th and 20th century scientists and researchers, they had been available on the Smithsonian Library's website since 2003. And in the first 3 months on Flickr Commons, they received as many visits as during the previous 5 years combined on our own websites. And then next week, just a little preview, is the Smithsonian's Latino Center will open the Smithsonian's first virtual museum in Second Life. So we're really looking forward to that and excited about seeing the kind of traffic that may generate. In reading up on Dr. Anderson, I came across an article that he wrote on active imagination. And that particularly struck me as the mother of a 7-year-old boy, and those of you with children know why. But Dr. Anderson leads the article with the common phrase of, he has an active imagination. And then he goes on to explain that such is the stinging rebuke for a child's free associations or fears. Later in life, this phrase is invoked to suggest that a purported threat is an illusion. In both cases, the reflex is to shut down the most natural of our impulses, the predisposition to find our way in life, not through research or instruction, but through play, instinct, and imagination. I suggest emerging technologies are providing opportunities to share our collections, research, and expertise through play, instinct, and imagination. We need to shape opportunities for our visitors to repurpose and engage and share our authority as active participants in the increase and diffusion of knowledge. At the recent Smithsonian 2.0 gathering, we had over 30 individuals from web and new media experts, and they were teamed up and met with 30 Smithsonian staff members to generate a vision of what a digital Smithsonian might look like and what it might be like in the years ahead, and looked at exploring how to make Smithsonian collections and educational resources and staff more accessible, engaging, and more useful to a younger audience. These younger generations will largely experience these things digitally. They encouraged us to share our authority, to promote repurposing, and challenged us to share our collections and knowledge, even though it may not be fully vetted. Dr. Anderson has over 20 years as a museum director, overseeing museums including the Whitney Museum of American Art and Toronto's Art Gallery of Ontario, and currently the Indianapolis Museum of Art, providing him with practical experience from which we will all benefit today. And he too must face these same challenges. Dr. Anderson also serves as a research affiliate for Princeton University's Center for Arts and Cultural Policy Studies, a program of the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, and writes a column on art world trends for the Art newspaper. Dr. Anderson has championed both the use of multimedia and networked information to connect visitors with collections in practice and as an internationally known speaker and author of many publications. Over a decade ago, he co-authored the book, The Wired Museum, Emerging Technology and Changing Paradigms, identifying different areas in which technology would reshape the museum experience. In particular, opening collections to enable different ways to look at objects and open them to new audiences. His publications on museums and technology have also promoted greater transparency among institutions, and his advocacy led the IMA to launch in 2007 the first real-time museum dashboard, including soliciting commentary from the general public about the museum's commitment to openness. Dr. Anderson received an AB from Dartmouth in 1997 with highest distinction in art history and a PhD from Harvard in 1981. He worked at the Metropolitan Museum of Art as a curator of Greek and Roman art from 1981 to 1987, and during his tenure, he taught in the Department of Art and Archaeology at Princeton and at the University di Roma. He has also been a past president of the Association of Art. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Maxwell Anderson. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ann. I think I know the password. I broke into it earlier today. Let's see here. Sorry about this delay. And thank you for your warm welcome. It's certainly standing on the shoulders of giants to be with you today, because so much of what happens at the IMA is a function of a dedicated team of people who work in technology, but equally the efforts of the whole staff to address the challenges that public institutions face today in being open and available, but also leading. And that's the combination of challenges that all of us face in every institution across the world, of being at one time in the research end and at the other time in the end of presentation and access. So what I want to do in basically an hour, for those of you who have the patience to stick it out either on the web or in person, is focus on technology as a way of being transparent. And so I'll skip over all the obvious things that we talk about when we talk about technology and really move towards something else, which is the premise of institutional behavior changing as we confront the fact that as public institutions, we're no longer able to manage ourselves privately. We might as well figure out what that means and how we behave internally. And so I'm going to go through a fair bit of what we've done at the IMA to address this, and in some ways, after an initial resistance to transparency, how it's become cult-like at our museum. And I hope very much that that cult isn't something which is deleterious to the museum's ambitions. And I, as an art historian in particular, who start with the object and end with the object, look at technology as a means to an end, not as something to fall in love with by itself. But in that sense, I think what I'm going to be talking about today is specifically germane to art museums, but I hope is extensible to all kinds of museums. I start with a memo from President Obama. Here we are in DC and at the Smithsonian. I want to make sure you've all read this memo, issued on March the 10th, 3:15 p.m. Subject, transparency and open government. And the President states that my administration is committed to creating an unprecedented level of openness in government. We will work together to ensure the public trust and establish a system of transparency, public participation, and collaboration. Openness will strengthen our democracy and promote efficiency and effectiveness in government. So I feel like we all have a mandate now to march forward in unison and with brio and enthusiasm about this impulse. I'm showing you a map of part of the United States for those who haven't been to Indianapolis, which I'm guessing may be a fair number of you. And although I don't have a pointer here, if you look at the extreme left, there's an A on the map, which is Indianapolis, and on the extreme right is a Washington. And it's to show you that actually, although we are far, far away, we're separated only by a couple of states, Ohio in particular, Pennsylvania, and then some other also interstitial areas. But although it's a world away from Washington, D.C., but of course transparency and technology does is to erase some of the distances between places and make the actions of one place potentially relevant to another, which would never have thought of it. So this is basically an exercise in freeing up people to get on the road or head to the airport. And briefly, I wanted to show you a little bit about the place that I work in, which is a museum, but also a place of some scale in grounds, 152 acres of grounds. And our grounds extend to that oxbow all the way up at the top left of the slide and down the White River surrounds our 100-acre sculpture park, which will be opening next year, a contemporary art park with commissions that are underway right now. And on the bottom right of the slide, that triangle is the main grounds of the museum campus with our main building and several other buildings around as well. So there's no cornfield in sight, and also there's an abundance of water and nature, and part of what we're trying to do as an institution in thinking about technology and transparency is opening up avenues of understanding that extend beyond the art collection to responsibilities for the natural environment and responsibilities that we have in a more general sense. Among the other things we have is a gauge in the White River to monitor the flood stage, because when the White River gets to a flood stage, it actually heads into our lake and then crosses over and can create some real challenges. So we've worked with the U.S. Geological Service to put up a real-time gauge in the river that alerts everyone in a graphic way that the water's coming. My odyssey towards transparency began a while back. Anne was kind to recite chapter and verse a lot of my life, but really it was in around this time, 2002, I was asked to speak at a conference at Columbia from the National Arts Journalism Program. And it was to prepare a seminar and conversation that would lead to a book called The New Gatekeepers: Emerging Challenges to Freedom of Expression in the Arts. And I was at the time director of the Whitney, which is shown at the top right there, and was facing a mounting challenge in museums in New York in particular, I think, about the desire for commercial success and appeal and box office results with the need for research and, in the case of the Whitney, pioneering behavior around contemporary art and looking for opportunities to lead rather than simply manifest what was popular. So at the conference, I said a couple of things that came into the book as well that helped guide me in thinking about later revelations in technology. One of them was that growth and endowment is the best defense against imagining that increased admission income is a museum's salvation. And another perspective was that museum boards are increasingly seduced by the possibility of attracting a mass audience. This inevitably leads to varying degrees of self-censorship to maximize attendance. And by self-censorship, I mean the path that you don't follow as a curator, because an exhibition might be thought to be unpopular or controversial or unfundable or in some other way not measuring up to what might otherwise be demanded of you. And self-censorship, I believe, is a much bigger problem than many others in the museum field, because it's the choices we don't make because they're difficult, which actually would enrich the body of research and knowledge and understanding that we have to find a way to pay for and present, and not begin with what's easiest to pay for and present that. So this led, after the talk and preparations for it, to ultimately I left the Whitney as director, in part over a disagreement with my board about what the priorities of the museum should be in relation to this question of popularity versus thinking about the leading edge, and wrote an essay at the invitation of the Getty called Metrics of Success in Art Museums. And on their website, it shows the essay still sitting up there as a kind of 5-year-old premise, but I was trying to draft a series of thoughts for colleagues in the field about how museums really needed to rethink measuring progress and success. And it allowed me to begin to think about, if I had the chance again to run an art museum, what would I want to inculcate among my colleagues as a way of behaving and working professionally? And I wrote in the essay for the Getty that half a century ago, art museums were largely measured by a yardstick comparable to that applied to libraries of the time, the size and importance of their collections. And adding to that, but today art museums increasingly are, to their detriment, places that privilege entertainment over learning. So arriving, as I did, to the IMA, I was able 3 years ago to start working with colleagues there in understanding where some of the received wisdom might need some tuning. And one area is that the premise that attendance growth is the holy of holies has some problems attached to it. And the problems are laid bare if we look at some statistical evidence, which is only as accurate as the statistical gathering, which isn't always helpful. But in the case of the Association of Art Museum Directors, the AAMD, which is the 190 or so largest art museums in the US, Canada, and Mexico, we annually survey each other's results, and we promise not to publish them. It's a fantastic act of imminent transparency. We're going to get to the point where we will be publishing that data, and we're working towards that. But for the time being, you're able to take the data and parse it as a member of the association and discover that if you add up the budgets of all the art museums in the association, which includes several here on the Mall, as well as across the country, you get to almost $2 billion in expense. Sounds like a big number. It is a big number. Then if you add up all of our admissions revenue, you get to 91.9 million, which I think even someone who's arithmetically impaired could agree means that 95% of our revenue does not come from tickets. Now, this is a little shocking as a statistic every time I share it with someone in the corporate world or someone who assumes from reading newspapers or watching TV that all we care about is how many people come through the door because that's how we stay healthy. When actually that's not quite the case, in the case of art museums in particular, which are places that more often than not are free or in some level reduced in expense relative to peer institutions. And the scary statistic that comes out of a next set of data is that everyone who walks through the door of an AMD museum, on average, costs us $52. By which I mean you take the number of visitors, you take the operating budget, and you divide, and it's a very raw calculation, but it's as legitimate as any other statistic we could throw out. And so I once had a trustee ask me, why don't we just pay people $20 to stay outside? And then we'd save $32. And intuitively that makes sense, but it doesn't actually accomplish the mission of the museum. And it gets more complicated when you look at the average per visitor admissions income across our great land, factoring in the fact that many museums like yours and mine are free and others charge. You get to $2.40 per head. So you've got this gap of $50 for everyone who walks in the door, and you wince whenever someone walks in the door. You're digging yourself deeper and deeper into debt. And so the predicament when you share that kind of transparently, that information, it doesn't lead to a quest for greater transparency. It leads to, my God, can we keep this to ourselves and just press ahead? And the answer, I think, is no, because instead we need to make a case for why it is the case that museums are red ink businesses, and what we can do, not to look for more money per se, but to make sure that whatever it is we're putting on and providing for in conservation and education and research and publishing, we find a way to pay for it and recognize that it is not a place to look for a pot of gold. I think part of our predicament is that we as professionals haven't devoted enough time to really describing what it is we do and how we do it. And the predicament for those who want to become more transparent is if you're not doing things and measuring things accurately and then you go clean, you may find that there's a fair bit of strange information that comes out or information that doesn't help you in making a case for your mission. But I go back even further and say, beyond measuring, we don't have a very good case to make in the public sector of saying why we matter. The best evidence of that is a few weeks ago when the Senate passed the Coburn Amendment, which excluded museums along with casinos and golf courses from being eligible to receive part of the package of the stimulus. And that was really a call to arms, I think, for the museum profession, to recognize how far we've fallen in public estimation, that we should be lumped together with our brethren who run casinos. And we have some work to do ahead, but it's not like we can rely on the press to help us, because here's a page from the New York Post some years ago, Dung Ho, about the work in the Sensation exhibition in Brooklyn. That's the kind of coverage incrementally that is coming to museums and over the years. And also the fact that bloggers are now replacing journalists as newspapers continue to lay off arts writers and critics and reporters. We see instead the growth of a separate universe of anointment about authority and responsibility in institutions, and that is in the blogosphere. It is not in newspapers, which are increasingly shrinking. So what is our option if not transparency? Because we're watching how the blogosphere, which is composed of people of great variety in training and background and expertise and in energy level, can be someone who is respected widely and followed widely, or someone who is making a free association that ends up. And the only way we can defend ourselves from being, in effect, defined by others all the time is by defining ourselves more clearly. Certainly the other big value to transparency has to do with fundraising challenges, and if you're going to make a case to patronage, whether it's corporate or government or foundation or individuals, you need to be able to call to mind the reasons for support and the basis for outcomes and what you're achieving. And we talk a lot about outcomes these days because foundations increasingly demand it of us, and certainly in government you have that as an accountability question day in, day out. But reporting statistics isn't the same as defining outcomes, as Stephen Weil, the late great Stephen Weil of the Smithsonian, so ably put it. So we're left with this rather daunting series of challenges about transparency. We think we know what it is and we want it, but how do we get started and what is it we should be transparent about in the end? And I think the point about being open about how your institutions work isn't simply to be open for the sake of earning public approval. It's how will that help reshape a museum and make it consequential in ways that matter to you and make it follow in step with your mission and the objectives that you should have in your mission. So I think there are a lot of museums that might describe themselves as lax in management just because they haven't really walked up to some of the demands that are now upon us and have much preferred to lope along either through the siphon of endowment or support from other quarters. And then there are other museums that are self-conscious about having things revealed that are embarrassing. And of course, the cure of all of that is to remember that there's room for improvement. So isn't that great that when you become transparent and you can improve your behavior, it just looks great online. And then there are those other museums that think they're very well managed, which is great. And then you also would ask the question that follows, they're well managed and they're describing who they are at the same time, but are they measuring in the right ways? So there are three things that I consider important to downplay, which are the three things that is basically all we talk about in the public sphere when we're defending ourselves, when we're saying we matter, we need support, we should be funded, we are consequential in society. And they're the three things that are the most problematic. One is attendance, which is a word that has an almost holy aura to it. And there's not a meeting of museum leaders where people don't say, how's your attendance doing? As if something's going to come out of that question and answer that's going to help you. And another one, how many members do you have? Or how's your membership doing? And the third question is, how are you doing with blockbuster shows? How many of you had? What's your next show? How exciting is that? So here's why, briefly, I think these three ways of measuring museums are fundamentally problematic. One, when we say attendance, we don't know how people are measuring attendance unless they're very explicit. It's not, you say, before you tell me how your attendance is, how do you measure it? So I literally know of instances where attendance is estimated, which is a wonderful way of measuring, and others where people use clickers and others where people use electronic means. But none of them, to my knowledge, would reveal the difference between number of people attending and number of individual human beings attending in the course of a year. They're different numbers, and I'll explain why. In our case, certainly, at the IMA, we have a succession of visitors who come on multiple occasions. Our members, for example, come on average from our market research about 5 times a year, and we have 11,000 member households in a modest 1.8 million Midwestern city, the 12th largest city in the country. So we have 3 to 4 people in those households. They might come as many as 5 times a year. You start noticing that, in fact, the number of visitors isn't quite the same as the number of individuals who visits. And to say that is to start revealing a fault line in what we do in our propaganda about museums. Non-members visit the IMA 2.4 times a year. So since we're free, what's the reason to join for some people? Just come for free without joining. So you start adding up the math, and it gets a little problematic if you're making a case that we have 430,000 visitors. That doesn't mean we have 430,000 people who use the museum. So talk about transparency. That's probably the scariest slide I'm going to show today, and I encourage anyone who is fearful about it to seek counseling and recognize that if everybody calculates the same way I just did, we'll all be fine. But if I'm the only one doing it, I'm in big trouble right now. My membership and attendance are now much smaller. Membership is the other piece that people like to talk about because it's thought to be a barometer of health in a community, how consequential you are to your community, how many members you have. The only problem with that is that entry-level memberships are transactional, and they're evidence of thrift. And we know that because people join museums, in my case in art museums, when there's a big show coming up and they want to have to wait in line and they want to go to the preview, and then when there's no big show, maybe they don't join or they let it lapse. And if you make any change in what you're offering, they call in protest and say, my membership should cover that. So it's a transaction, it's a thrift basis, which we encourage. But there's attached to that an opportunity cost, because obviously by offering memberships at a low rate, are you really paying for all the staff associated with that? The development staff, the events, the marketing, printing, postage, the overhead associated with the program. When people talk about membership expense, they don't generally go the whole distance. And so if you do that on memberships under a certain level, you actually discover that it's a lost leader in many places. But it's the bragging rights of I have X number of members. And there's nothing wrong with membership. It's a great tool to get people in the door and become committed. But to look at it as an arbiter of economic health is not, I think, frankly, a useful thing. And then you move on to the thing that everybody loves in the newspaper business, which is blockbusters. But what very few museums do is to measure the net return after you factor in staff time of a blockbuster, because a lot of the shows we do at the IMA take 3 or 4 years to plan. We have some of our best compensated staff working on them day after day, week after week. And if you add up the salaries of our curators and registrars and conservators, just those three, and then factor in the educators a little later in the game, it'd be very skeptical if a, quote, blockbuster, even with all the sponsorship in the world, pays for itself. But this is what we talk about in common parlance as important to museums, is having the big show that draws the big crowd, and then we roll out the economic impact studies, and everyone is delighted by the results. But actually, there's another cost to exhibitions, which is the opportunity cost of what you're not doing with your collection, and what you're not doing in research and publication that aren't attached to the spectacle that came to town. So I have nothing against blockbusters. I don't like the word, but I have nothing against big shows. I like it when they contribute actively to the mission of the institution and don't drain resources, and then when you're actually candid about what they've brought in economic terms, rather than making them into the second coming. So it leads us to 3 things I don't think you should focus on ever in transparency. You should find ways of talking about those 3 subjects in a contextual way, but not make them the focus, as we are tempted to do. So I posit a few things that would be useful, and I'm going to give you an exercise in a few minutes, which is why I'm trying to prompt some thinking. And I want to give you 10 sample issues about which transparency would be welcome, I think, in all of our museums or museums anywhere in the world. So one would be the commercial instinct in exhibition creation, and how that actually shrinks our capacity to dream and imagine if the first question is it sponsorable as an exhibition? How many people are going to come? How much are we going to sell in the store? Will it drive membership? Which is the litany of questions that we're always asked. And we need to find a way to measure the decision-making and describe and be transparent about the decision-making and how shows are arrived at. It's a way of revealing what is actually, where I started, the self-censorship problem, the problem of not doing things because they don't measure up in all of these commercial ways. Another thing that we could be usefully transparent about is how we've had resistance for the illicit trade in antiquities, which until recently, certainly a lot of the art museums in our country were having difficulties adapting to a challenge, and the challenge was behaving differently around acquisitions to acknowledge a role, even a fairly passive role and down the line of acquiring objects which made their way out of a probable country of modern discovery in an illicit fashion. And I think we've walked up to that, but I don't think we've gone the full distance in understanding how transparency can serve us in all of that. The same might be true of the problems of Holocaust-era acquisitions of works that left Nazi Germany and its protectorates in the course of the 1930s and 40s, and even the legacy beyond that. There's a diminishing appetite to study this problem, do research, follow it on, and particularly now with the economy in such shambles, the first thing to go in a lot of institutions most likely will be research around inquiries like this, which are so important. This is a German church with a GI standing among crates of what we're talking about, Nazi loot. And here's the Rose Art Museum, and we are very prepared, it seems, as museums to harangue and gesticulate about deaccessioning, but if we're going to do that, my point would simply be then we have to be very clear about what we each as institutions are doing in deaccessioning. You can't just call out an errant colleague and not yourself reveal how you proceed. Because the very word deaccessioning, it's a $10 word, it doesn't mean anything to almost anybody other than people in museums. And I think it's essential that we're much more clear about what it is we do as processes in deaccessioning and selling and trading and exchanging works of art. And I'll show you a little bit of what we're doing with that in Indianapolis. I think the strategic planning is a phrase. I had a brief period of liberty as a consultant between running museums, and I did strategic planning for a while and came to find it a very problematic area of specialization because it sounds fancy and as if you're going to get somewhere, but of course we all know what normally happens is the consultant finishes the report, it sits on the shelf, and in a panic before a board meeting you run back to see how far you've come. And I think if we can open up the process of both planning and progress on plans in a way that's revelatory and present all the time, then a strategic plan has a purpose. But if it's simply this nagging conscience that you have to go back to because you need one to apply for grants, then it's not going to work. And I think greater sense of ownership will come out of that process of being more revealing about how we plan. Also, how we're organized as institutions is so mysterious. When you ask a peer institution for an org chart, you generally throw up your hands and not being able to understand their logic model versus yours. And I think working together as institutions to be more, sharing about how we are structured, how we make decisions. And I often have people ask how we are structured, and I do the same with other institutions. But being more clear about lines of responsibility and how teams are formed, what their purposes are, can only help for institutions to model their professional conduct and behavior. One of the more outlying areas of transparency probably has to do with merchandising, which again, we're all asked to be businesslike, especially now more than ever. And so the problem there, similar to the problem around membership, is that we tout how much money is made in museum stores around the country. We tend not to comment on how much the staff who run the museum stores cost or how much the rent that we're not paying costs. So to model ourselves as effective businesses that are merchandising and producing this wonderful educational material, in fact, a lot of museums around the country are, if they're lucky, break even. But the first court of interest for so many people attached to museums who are from the corporate world is to say, how's your store doing? Can we do better with our store? Again, we're so hopelessly red ink businesses that because of the overhead of producing the product and developing it and researching it and having the opportunity and obligation to teach from our stores rather than just think about what's going to sell best, weighs us down. It's this conscience of the nonprofit world that we all live for. But it also means we shouldn't trot out faux economics about the efficiency of our stores. Like the Mall of Smithsonian, the IMA has a lot of grass, but also a lot of other areas to take care of, 152 acres. And I think it's important today for institutions who have a great deal of land to acknowledge that we have responsibility for that land and that we can be places that model in our behavior on the best practices of a green agenda and also have that effect on others in our communities. And this is a slide, a very truncated slide of part of our grounds with the biggest green roof in Indiana. It's a 15,000 square foot roof over our parking garage, which is basically just grass, and it allows us to both hide the ugliness of a parking garage, but also to be part of a wave of construction impulses across the country that are thoughtfully addressing the issues that we face with hardscape. We all serve food in our museums, and I live in a part of the country that has a real problem with obesity, and yet how many of our institutions face down the challenge of what we serve, and the fact that we offer so many unhealthy food choices across the country actually connects to our mission as educational institutions. It connects to our obligations as leaders in the context of the nonprofit world. But I think in a more general sense, the biggest and recurring problem that we need to address through transparency is our professional business practices and motives, and make sure that as we work day to day, that work is informed by collective understanding of how individual units of expertise, whether they're departments or divisions or individuals, work together across a series of guidelines and objectives and timetable and share with people what we're trying to achieve. And so much of what we do is under the cover of darkness. And for a lot of museums, the smallest percentage of space in that museum is the public space. The rest is storage in back of the house and research and education spaces, which are critical for the museum's life, but they're not available. And they're not made known to the public in ways that would explain that $52 expense for an art museum, that most of that expense is not on the floor in the front. It is in the back of the house, or it's retaining a 50% relative humidity and 700,000 square feet of building space in our case, or the security costs, or the research and conservation costs. Opening that up, making it clear, is so critical at a time when the American public, through our lawmakers, seem not to understand why we deserve to be separate and apart from casinos and golf courses. So one example of transparency in collecting antiquities, I would cite, is something that I proposed to the Association of Art Museum Directors when we were revising our guidelines around collecting antiquities. And we got to the point of saying that if something hasn't got provenance, having left its country of probable modern discovery before 1970, you shouldn't acquire it. And the decision was made by the majority that there should be an exception, that if you believed and had circumstantial evidence that something had done so, you could still feel free to acquire it, but you had to in some way do something to make that manifest. So I proposed that we build a shared website where those individual institutions that made acquisitions of objects that lacked complete provenance would have to put them up in public view. Not so much to allow them to be found, because the odds of that are infinitesimal. If they left a place in a clandestine way, it's not like the clandestini are going to come and say, that was my discovery. So it's more a hair shirt. It's more making sure that few institutions avail themselves of this exception. And so we have one object on this AAMD, objectregistry.org, which has led some journalists to say, museums are being secretive. They're hiding all their acquisitions. And in fact, all it means to me is that nobody is acquiring antiquities without provenance, because in our little club of 180 museum directors, if someone were to break ranks, there would be hell to pay. So this is clearly an example of how transparency can have an effect on behavior and literally reshape how a discipline looks at itself, looks at its moral, civic, societal, professional obligations, and simply by virtue of revealing our behavior, change how we behave. One thing we do need to stop doing, I think, is pandering and being transparent in our pandering. And I think that's very much the case when we stand up in public testimony and claim that we are going to be able to replace schools, power our local economies, and reduce crime. And that is very much the mantra that museums have taken to of late, and particularly in communities where the museum is not the core, the essence of institutional life in the city, or even of a place of refuge for many, where it's simply a beside-the-point place. And if we start focusing on these instrumental values, we lose track of our primary purpose. But the temptation is always there. And there are many places around the United States where crime is on people's minds, and probably will become more so with the declining economy. So the question comes back, what are you, Max, going to do about the crime wave? And I simply don't think we should say, well, we're going to figure that out, we're going to help you on that front, we're going to take care of that for you so we can get your money. It simply doesn't work that way. And it's fine to say we contribute to those in various ways, certainly after-school programs that we present at the museum, arguably, not provably. I don't assume that everyone who comes to an after-school program would otherwise be a felon. So I don't start there. But it's arguable that by having after-school programs, we create a climate in which it is preferential behavior to be associated with others studying art and experiencing it than committing a crime. But I can't prove it, and I'm not about to set out and study that. So I think we have to be, we're pleasers by nature. We're nonprofit. We love pleasing people. We love teaching and educating and enriching. But being a pleaser when you get up in the morning doesn't mean you should be that when you're at your laptop or giving a speech or sitting in front of a hearing room. You have to make a case for why we matter in the core of what we do. So when you came in, I think you were given a little flyer and a piece of paper. And I wanted to practice with a question for all of you. And all of you watching from home, feel free to fill out the same question. And I'm afraid I'm going to give you my email address at the end of this, so I have no idea what that means, but that is the ultimate in transparency for me. So what I'd like you to think about and consider a little bit for 4 minutes or 5 minutes is, what's the single most compelling example of transparency you would like to see your museum provide? Or if you're nervous about your museum, a museum, because I recognize that we don't all want to reveal things that we don't think are completely transparent about our museum. So there are a couple of examples might be compensation of the highest paid employees in your museum in comparison with other museums. And it's not reasonable just to publish the statistics by themselves, although we, of course, do. It's more, how does it compare with peer institutions that might be interesting? Because then you can see how competitive you are in a marketplace. Or the percentage of your collection that's adequately cataloged and illustrated online. So that, as a piece of transparency, might reveal the progress you have in making your collection known. Or lastly, the average amount of time spent by visitors in front of the 10 works in your collection you consider game-changing, the best objects you have, and that might reveal the quality of your collections or the successes you have in interpretation. So what I'd suggest, instead of this being completely solipsistic, is if you just turn to the person to your left and right, and I know all of you can figure that out, even if you're not sitting next to somebody, and agree on one question among the three of you, and then we'll pass that up to the front, and I'll read from a couple of those. So with that, feel free to play along at home, and let's get to work for about 4 or 5 minutes. Okay, so listen, this is great for me. I get to go home with a whole bunch of new questions to pose to my colleagues at the IMA, and what I would be happy to do is try to put some of these together as I collect them around the country with other suggestions. Here's one interesting one I'll just single out. How and what exhibitions are proposed for the museum? Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily trackable or wouldn't be without embarrassment for those that have been proposed, but it's an interesting point back to the earlier note I made about the self-censorship and what we don't do. And I am eager to collect these both now and, as I say, online, so I will get you that address at the end. Thank you for that little exercise. It was meant to keep you awake in the middle of the talk, and I think by the evidence of my senses, it succeeded, so thank you. I'll turn to a few self-promoting screenshots of what we're doing in Indianapolis and hope that we can learn from some of what you may have to say after the talk in questions, because what we've been doing since January of '07 when it launched was looking at ways of measuring outcomes. And I know many of you have seen this, so it's more about the background of how the dashboard's various parts came together and what we're trying to do next with them. So like many museums, we have a lengthy mission statement. And mercifully, it's only in 2 paragraphs, but that the IMA serves the creative interests of its communities by fostering exploration of art, design, and the natural environment. The IMA promotes these interests through the collection, presentation, interpretation, and conservation of its artistic, historic, and environmental assets. And with that as our predicate, we started to think about what it was that an institution might do if it were to provide something that was visually attractive, because many dashboards are not. And as an art museum, what was our choice? We had to start with that as a predicate. And what might, in fact, in terms of design, be open source that we could then send out to anybody who wants it, which is the case. Any museum that wants the source code for this is welcome to it. We just ask that perhaps you contribute something that we haven't thought about and we can work together on improving. And so the screens, there are 9 main screens on the dashboard, but many, many others behind each of these under the button More on each screen that are meant to be pulling out some relevant information that we consider of interest and information that changes relatively frequently. It's not necessarily the most important information, but we don't want the page to look the same every day, so on here there are several fields that we'll look at in greater depth. I was asked over lunch, how many employees do you have? I said, well, a funny thing, it's on the dashboard. But more important than the fact that we have close to 300 employees is what departments they're in, because doesn't that tell you a story about a museum? We talk about our values and our priorities, and if you have 70 people in development and 3 curators, it's a statement of value of some sense. So I was happy when I saw the slide to see we have, according to the 16 people, full-time in curatorial, part-time, what is it now, part-time 3, and then in development 12. So, dodged it, you know. And part of the time when I look at this is I really don't know what's going to go up there until I look at it, and I ponder for a minute. So a lot of people are seeing this other than me, and how does that affect me? And that is, of course, a question that's legitimate, but ultimately is not the point. And so we are simply revealing what we think are our priorities and where these employees work. Now, it's a very rough cut. Obviously, it doesn't tell you what they do. It doesn't tell you how their time is spent or their seniority or anything of the sort. But it's a good first cut at understanding institutional priority. And imagine if all the museums in a like organization, like AMD, were to have a comparable set. You could begin to create some interesting information out of that. So our endowment is, by many measures, a large endowment, a $275 million endowment. As of March the 2nd, this screen was published, and it's a calculation from January 31st. And it's a healthy number, of course. But then if you start looking down the same page, you see where it was at the bottom right in August of '08. And since we track a dashboard by period, you watch its incredible decline. Starting at the bottom right is almost $370 million to today. We've lost over $100 million since September. And I think that accomplishes two things. One, it certainly braces our development department to think about its quest. And as they say, you know what, it isn't the worst thing in the world that people no longer think we're rich. They think we're wealthy, but we're not really rich anymore, and we've lost a great deal. So I think when the first tsunami of problems around the economy began to surface and museums were being asked, well, how's your endowment doing? A lot of places decided, you know, we'll get back to you on that. And I just said, well, it's on the dashboard, so, you know, go find it. Contributed support also, if you look at the bottom of the slide, we were way behind in contributed support year to date, and there's an odd thing about our year. We changed this year from a December 31st fiscal year end to a June 30th fiscal year end. So I'm actually living, unlike the rest of you, in an 18-month year. That is, we closed the books June 30th, but we started way back in January of '08. So unlike the rest of the world, I operate on a lunar calendar or something. I don't know how it works. And yet we've caught up in contributed support in terms of contributed support as a percentage of the current budget period. So we're just 5% behind, which is interesting, and reporters have asked a lot of museum directors and others, how are you doing with the economy? And I was quoted early on saying that philanthropy doesn't necessarily suffer across the board, that there is a shakeout and different things happen, but that the private individuals who continue to give often continue to give at a flat continued rate. Maybe it doesn't grow as much. In our development area, we have a set of areas we track, and among them are those that I'll delve into a little bit here. The first is membership revenue, and again, historic period from February to March, we doubled our membership revenue. And so I'm not allergic to membership revenue, but I would say on a $33 million operating budget, this isn't going to transform the institution overnight. It's nice to have, we appreciate the support, thank you, hence the bags of money on the right. And then we track how many visitors who visit us are members. I think it's a key indicator of membership, much more important than the number of members, arguably, is, well, those people who are loyal to you, how loyal are they to you, and how often do they come? What percentage of your makeup entirely do members make? And those are the kinds of questions qualitatively about the experience that take you back to the larger question of why membership matters. And surely it matters to build a bond between the institution and a community. And memberships proper haven't really changed that much since the economic downturn. I know a lot of institutions face different situations just based on the market that they're in. And Indianapolis's economy has managed to hold on fairly well through the worst of this. And for whatever reason, our membership has stayed relatively flat. And these are member households, so as in, again, 3 to 4 people per member household. We track a lot of dimensions of activity in the curatorial department and the education department and conservation, and we show here a number of treatment hours in conservation, a number of examination hours, and someone pointed out to me that that's actually not an enormous number of hours since January 1st. What are your conservators doing exactly if they're not treating or examining? I said, well, we have these things that the IMA called meetings. Don't know if you're familiar with them. They do suck up a fair bit of time. And frankly, a revelation like this leads our conservators to say, are we getting enough time in the lab? And it's a perfectly legitimate measurement on a dashboard that leads to the question, what else are they doing? Maybe they need to do less of that and make more time. So that's perfect application of it. Backing up here, I think it's the 418 works of art with gaps in World War II era provenance. So this is a number that has grown since I arrived simply because the curators in the affected areas have been doing more research and found more gaps. So ironically, the more you learn, the less you know. I think that's an adage all of us grew up with. And we still have no claims on any objects in the collection, but we obviously track them, and they're all illustrated if you go through, and they're followed. So it's not only on the portal that the American Association of Museums built, the NAPIP portal, the Nazi era provenance information portal, but also in greater depth here. This is one of my favorite ones, which is new works of art on view. Because when you talk about a museum, you generally talk about the permanent collection, and the eyes glaze over and say, oh yeah, I've seen your permanent collection. Well, no, you haven't. There are 112 new works of art since January 2009 in the permanent collection. And they're there because they're on loan. They're taken out of storage to replace a work that went out on loan. They're there because they've just been conserved. They're there because they've just been acquired. All good reasons, but our message to visitors is when you come see our permanent collection, it's never the same. It's like Heraclitus talking about standing in a river. It's always changing. And this allows you to click through to any of the images below, find your way to that object, find its background and information. And we hope detonate the idea that you've seen the permanent collection. Because if you click on one of them, here's a portrait by George Romney. You find your way to the catalog information, and it gives you some background and sense of what that object is and the like. So the examination hours, as I said, is something critical for our conservators to track insofar as understanding how productive they are and how much more time they actually could use to do things. Here's another key indicator, which is a very low number and, again, embarrassing. How many works of art are out on loan to other institutions? We only have 13. Imagine the Smithsonian. I don't even want to think how many tens of thousands of things you have out and about around the world, around the land. And these are works you can click on and you find out where they are, but to us it's definitely an indicator of the relevance of our institution to peer institutions around the world. And I'm happy to say the request for loans has grown dramatically, even as our acceding to those loans has not. So probably that question from the audience about how many shows are you offered or proposed that you presumably don't take, it might be pretty revealing to say how many loan requests do you have. We have a program called Viewfinders, which is for every third grader in the city of Indianapolis who come, and in Washington Township is close to us, and they are obligated to come to the museum in the course of the spring after having spent a part of every week in their school looking at works of art in the collection in the classroom. And as I mentioned, I think there are dimensions of institutional behavior and life that go beyond the core mission to the aspects of institutional character in terms of how important you are to others. So how many requests for photography have we had, presumably largely of works of art, for projects, publications, and how many images have been created of the grounds and the museum. Our photography department monitors this like hawks because they want to show how productive they are. And they know that we look at this in general, we, capital we, the senior management and the rest of the staff. We now measure our kilowatt hours per day in a pretty accurate sense. We capture decatherms of gas as well as kilowatt hours of electricity, and we do this very consistent measurement. And it led to our becoming the first museum in the country with an Energy Star awarded by the EPA. And we basically have managed to reduce consumption of electricity and gas dramatically since we reopened after a 2-year expansion, which is counterintuitive because now you have all these warm bodies coming through using toilets and switching on lights that weren't on. But just because of the talent of our engineers, we've been able to keep this number shrinking up to a point where now we feel we're pretty much where we need to be. But that results in real savings. And this is just over the course of several months. Through the winter months, and of course year to year, we'll be able to track how we're doing in a December in relation to Decembers of the past 2 or 3 years, and do a calculation based on the price of energy to understand how we're performing. And I would hate to tell you how cheap energy is in the Midwest, but so I won't say that, but it's possible to get by with less expense there. I mentioned a flood gauge. This is the flood gauge of the White River, which as of, I think yesterday, was 6 feet below flood stage, which is great, by the way. We don't worry about 6 feet. When you get to 1 foot, you get a little anxious, but 6 feet is good. And it helps us monitor, frankly, as we move into a public phase of the Art and Nature Park, knowing when we might want to tell the visitors to get out of the park, and literally, but I think more importantly than that, because that's going to be a rare occurrence, I think rain might actually encourage people to get out of the park first. But it allows us to help work with the USGS in understanding the impact downstream, which is called downtown Indianapolis, what the White River is doing, and it's one of very, very few instances. We track new plantings. Obviously, our horticulture department is on it, making sure we calculate 30,000 plants planted last year. And then we get to the heart of what a lot of policy wonks and researchers love, which is data on visitors. And I'll just touch on a couple of touchstones. We had 421,000 visitors in calendar 08 and 460,000 in calendar 07. and we're on track with some new numbers I'll share with you. We also calculate how much time people spend on our website, and it's fascinating to watch it bump up and down. It sometimes is a function of new video we've put up, and that certainly will be more the case in time to come. And then visitors, this is again that raw attendance statistic, which is so meaningless in isolation, but fascinating for people. So here's a sample up till March 1st, and we see on the Sunday I highlighted 1,528 people in the door that day. I know that sounds paltry to my colleagues here at the Smithsonian, but it's an art museum in one city. So you watch on this bar and you notice what everybody intuitively would say, that the beginning of the week is slow and then it picks up, and on Mondays, although we're not open to the public, we have groups and visitors come in by appointment. So we capture here the fact the green bar is the special exhibition, which hadn't opened yet, and that only opened this past Sunday. So people in the visitor services area and marketing and in other parts of the museum can better understand patterns of need over the course of the building. So the past couple of weeks through Sunday, and you can begin to develop information about the heaviest use of the institution. And here's today's attendance. When I left the hotel at 10 a.m., we had 276 people in the door by 10:30 a.m. or whatever that says there. So I think the timeliness of this data is fun, but it's also eye candy, and it doesn't get us to the information we really need, which is what we're building towards, and I'll show you some of what we're developing around it. But my point simply is we describe how we measure it, which is an electronic eye, it's a thermal camera. We discount the number of staff and volunteers to get as close a number as possible, and we routinely check against clickers to make sure we're not living in some pipe dream. Here's the piece that's new as of just a few days ago, which is very powerful. And it's powerful because it's asking the question not about attendance, which is warm people through the threshold of the museum, but admissions who walk up to the front desk and have some kind of transaction, whether that's buying a ticket to a special exhibition, which we do charge for. We don't charge for general admission to the museum. Or for something in our theater, we have a 600-seat theater, we have an 800-seat amphitheater, and we have a 180-seat lecture hall. So there's all kinds of tickets at the IMA. But what we capture with any one of those transactions is the zip code of the person taking a ticket. And what you see here is just an interactive map. If I were to click on, if this were live, any of those icons, I would get to the number of visitors in that zip code. And that's fine, that's interesting. And here, since January 1st, you start to see the rollout of different zip codes in Indianapolis of people who have walked up to the front desk. And because we're free general admission, a lot of people just surf right past it and go up the stairs into the galleries. But we're going to try to make it more, I think, valuable for people to come to the front desk with promotions and offers and all sorts of fun things if you check in with us, even if you're not planning on paying. But the most powerful part about this is the socioeconomic data that kicks out. And here you see the education level of the individual and also the specifics that you get to around income, age, marital status, occupation, ethnicity. So all of that can be tracked in the sense of, in that zip code, obviously, we have basic information from the census, which will soon be brought up to date, and other sources. And we can begin understanding not only who's visiting the museum in terms of geographical area, but in socioeconomic status and education and in other respects. And the purpose of all this is what? The purpose is to know who is not visiting. What zip codes are not coming? What socioeconomic status is not taking advantage of us? Which educational levels are not taking advantage? And begin to think from an educational vantage point and a visitor services and marketing point of view, what do we have to do to fix that and bring it more in line with the general character of our community? So I think this is the most exciting piece of new information that we're collecting. And here we are spreading out from Indianapolis, and I can show this to lawmakers across the great state of Indiana and show our relevance to their communities and begin to unpack that. And I can even go out to, on a federal level, to start showing visitors from these different cities who come to the IMA, who've come since January. So it's a great tool for learning, and it's potentially a very powerful tool for understanding more about our institutions. One rather tricky topic is deaccessioning. I think a lot of museums have watched in recent weeks as there's been noise about it. And I would just say what we're doing a little differently as of a few days ago is there's a tab on IMA collections at the top left here, deaccessioned artworks. And there we have a précis of what we do around deaccessioning, how it works. We move on to our deaccessioning policy and the bases on which we deaccession and sell and exchange and transfer works. And then the Holy of Holies, we actually share with you what we're deaccessioning, and before the works are being sold, but after their deaccession, we give you the value assigned by the museum. We then move on to the vendor, as in recipient, in the case of most cases, an auction house. We give you the auction date it's going to be sold, and then when it's sold, we give you the value of the price it was sold for. So the premise here is, it's a tricky one, obviously, because a lot of museums coil, art museums in particular, at the creating of an equivalence between an object and a dollar, and saying they have no possible connection to each other. My point would be, before they come into the museum, they do, and after they leave the museum, they do. When they're in the museum, fine, let's not put prices on labels. I'm not for that. But I think it's an obligation of museums that are talking about deaccessioning openly to demand of ourselves that we reveal what this is all about. And reveal, really, almost as an art history lesson, why objects aren't deserving of being in the collection. What better way to teach connoisseurship to a Twitter-era audience who couldn't care about deaccessioning, except if you can start talking about connoisseurship and training the eye to see why this example of a 17th century portrait is vastly, demonstrably inferior to this example. So I see no real harm in it. Obviously, there are ways in which it's embarrassing and uncomfortable. So here's a deaccessioned work by Domenico Panetti, and you see an image of the work and then the price, valuation, auction sale price, $7,000 at Christie's, sold on January 28th. So terrifying to see, I have to tell you. It's not something that most museums have yet explored. And probably with good reason, because it's difficult unless you have accurate information and you want to devote the time and energy and resources to providing the context for it. I just have a few more slides. One, simply a reminder about how dashboards should motivate staff and supporters to improve performance. It can't just be about revelation for its own sake, but equally that if what you're putting up there doesn't make you uncomfortable, it's probably not evaluating the right stuff. And we have to consider the obligations that we have as public institutions. And as Stephen Weil put it in this very building years ago, we have to focus on outcomes, not outputs. And my CIO asked me to mention 4 things he thinks about in building out the dashboard, including good design, information fishhooks, topics that are engaging and interesting that will get you into the data that may not be, how this is really for a forest in the trees, you're trying to pull people out of this massive amount of information that could be collected and really try to make a virtue of that by focusing. And then looking at like institutions, because putting up data by ourselves, we feel very lonely in Indianapolis. We're very lonely people. We want more dashboards, we want more collaboration, we want more of a potential to evaluate across institutions and see what that might yield. And we want that effort to be always brought back to the mission of the museum and see if what we're analyzing is adequate. And we don't think so, obviously. One of the reasons I'm talking about it today is to elicit physically your notes about how to improve and what to build upon. And I would just say one thing here about Charity Navigator, and at the very real risk of being ungrateful. Of the 284 museums, or excuse me, I guess they're art museums or museums, on Charity Navigator, I think it's art museums, we are the #1 museum ranked by Charity Navigator, which is a website that tracks institutional performance and how you should give your money. I would like to publicly disavow that ranking today and say it means absolutely nothing to us. We don't embrace it, we don't welcome it, we don't want it. Because what this site actually does is it measured the revenues we had from the last period they were evaluating and the expenses, and said we had a lot more revenues than expenses. Well, we were in a capital campaign. So of course we had more revenue than expense. The next year we didn't, so we're going to drop in the next Charity Navigator to, site number 20. So you have to be careful in this evaluative information about what you're measuring and how you're measuring it, and this is an example that doesn't quite work. And I think in that sense, we put on our website our annual report. We put also our tax returns. So the 07 tax returns are up there, and we don't just have to wait for GuideStar. We publish them on the website as soon as we submit them to the IRS. And we also work through a series of efforts in welcoming audiences through a blog, which I encourage you to turn to. And my favorite bit of data is why people go to the website. It turns out now almost a third go to check out IMA art content, including videos and blogging and tagging. And we also, as you do, work with Facebook, as Anne was telling us. We have increasing interest in that, and we have a page on iTunes U, which has been very helpful. And we also work on the Steve Project with a bunch of other museums to explore tagging and how individual members of the public attaching definitions of works of art can actually help art historians learn how to talk about art. And I'll close with this one site, which is going up shortly, open. It's called Art Babble. And it's basically a video site, which is an exciting arena for multiple institutions to put their video in one place, not delimited by a single institution. And we have about 100 high-definition videos shot by our intrepid team at the IMA, which are populating this, but we will be shortly announcing several other major institutions and organizations that are putting up videos. And so the hope is that beyond series and channels and specific artists you'll be able to learn about and listen to, here's a documentary we did with Maya Lin for a commission she did at the museum. We also transcribe the videos. And so the point here is it's not just a YouTube for museums. Every video, every utterance in that video is transcribed so that when you look on Google prospectively and you find a word string, such as Vietnam Memorial, you'll find your way to this video and that stop, that second in Maya's interview, and that's how video actually becomes important in a real-time sense and not just enduring a video. Here's Orly Genger with a commission in our front entrance, and here I'll close with Rhett Reed, a member of our ground staff, one of many employee profiles that are on Art Babble as well, where we try to provide access for everyone involved. So what I would suggest anybody do who hasn't tackled this is set up a task force to do it, launch an application, blog about it, and then show it to your director after it's up. It's a safer bid. So I want to thank you very much for your time this afternoon and appreciate the invitation very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we have some time for questions, and we have two people with microphones. We'd like you to please ask your questions into the microphone because we do have a virtual audience, and we'd like them to be able to hear the questions. So we'll take maybe 20 minutes.
Thanks. And for all of you in the virtual audience, I know you're not virtual, you're real, but that's the way we're coming to you. So.
I was just wondering how the data in the dashboard is updated. Is it all automated, or do you have people doing it?
The problem with all the data being automated is no one would look at it anymore. So we have a kind of authority question where everything has to be culled and reviewed and examined by the respective division and departments that are responsible for the information. So in the case of a lot of it, it is automated at the outset, but it can't be posted on the dashboard and released until it's been reviewed. An example would be on a Monday when we're closed to the public, we might suddenly have some visitors who come in and out for a purpose which is not to visit the museum. We don't want that to go up and then have to take it down. So every screen is reviewed before it's published.
Hi, I would like to know, because obviously being transparent allows your visitors to know more about yourself, but lots of the example that you gave allow you to know more about your visitors too. So how do you practically use that information or plan to use it?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it starts, of course, with the social networking part of it, which I didn't spend as much time on, where we solicit participation by our audiences. And the predicate around, for example, the admissions review, where we try to discover who's visiting us, is to understand, an example I cited, who's not visiting us, and then go forward and examine how to reach them. So that would be probably through the school districts, and look for, in those zip codes, why those schools aren't sending us families, and what we can do to create an opportunity for that visit. And the public participation part of it is fairly new in that the dashboard isn't really built for that so much as it's meant to prompt conversation that then happens on our blogs and on Facebook and the like. And I would say it's fairly, I mean, it's 2 years old, and yet it's not like we're the first website everybody in the world turns to in the morning. So we're starting to get a fair bit of traffic and response. I think the Art Babble video site will really trigger that, because that also encourages responses from visitors. And I think it's a work in progress. I can't answer your question, say we've licked that. It's definitely something that we thought, again, start by getting accurate data, reveal it, and then see how that can help your mission.
I wondered if you've done anything with making your thought process transparent on what programs you do. For instance, having staff put up ideas of programs they're thinking about, or even having your visitors make suggestions.
Well, it's interesting you ask that, because art historians and curators are among the most guarded people in the world about intellectual property. And so when a curator is talking about a prospective exhibition with another curator, there's generally this febrile moment where, is my idea going to be stolen, is the first thing that comes out of their head. And I know we all have to grow up and get past that, but it actually is an issue, and we've had a couple of programs that were being devised at our institution that we suddenly saw elsewhere, in part because we're being so bloody transparent. So I understand the impulse, and I think it's worth asking. I don't know yet if my museum wants to be the first. I think we would leave that to someone else to be the first. I just don't want to ask any more of my curators. I've asked so much of them this year. I don't mean to be glib. It's a very good question.
Hello. How many categories of information were you measuring before you did the dashboard, and how many more categories and what categories have you developed to measure since you put up the dashboard?
I think how many people came and how many members we had is what we were measuring before. The very things I didn't think we should be measuring in isolation. And that's pretty typical, that the budget process that all of us go through every year as museums is actually a constant measurement. It's a measurement of priorities and values and ideals and who's winning, who's losing. And that's really where we measure, is how many dollars are we going to apportion to particular aspects of our mission. So I would say that, like most museums, we began this process with a budget as a way of evaluating and measuring, but not something that was indexed to performance in the way that we could have and are trying to do now. So broadly, it's not obvious to me that we can be a leader in that any more than any other museum, but I would love to understand it myself better, and it's certainly one of the things we're thinking about.
Would you be willing to read a number of the questions that came from this audience so those of us in the Smithsonian can know what our colleagues want to know about us?
Sure, happy to, Betsy. Thank you for the question. Some of them aren't precisely dashboard measurement questions, but they're transparency questions. What is your strategic plan, and how should it change with the plummeting economy? We need openness and transparency about building and construction processes so the public has up-to-date information. Routing procedures for acquisitions, publications, etc., in the hopes that the public shames us into making them more effective. I stumbled over that word, not because I didn't want to read it, I just couldn't read it. Couldn't see it. How is the Postal Museum perceived by the public? How is our museum perceived by the public? Parenthesis, like restaurants, they have reviews. Identity of corporate sponsors and amount and proportion of their contribution to the overall budget. How do the different Smithsonian Institution museums communicate, relate to one another, and share or compete for resources? Available programs and who to talk to in cases of confusion. Direct contact with the person doing the program. Transparency on an executive level, i.e. directors justifying huge salaries while programs are cut in collections. I would like to see a map of foot traffic in the museum so I know where most people go. What percentage of the overall budget of the Smithsonian is devoted to, I can't read this, something functions such as capital improvement, security, IT, education. Images on internet with collections information. Transparency in our decision-making processes. What choices have led to what's on view? Who's deciding what's on view? Transparency about comparative levels of compensation in all departments, i.e. are the interpreters of material or collections being compensated at the same level as administrators or others who provide support? How are decisions made with respect to programs, exhibitions? I see a few of those. Balance between research and public outreach. And here's a lively one to end on: how donors influence the content of exhibits. So.
Hi. You mentioned Steve Weil a couple of times, and it seems to me that one of the big questions that he always put on the table was how are museums changing the lives of their visitors and their audiences, and how are they really making a difference in their communities? And I don't quite see in this dashboard where those questions are being answered. And I'm wondering if there's another part of your talk or another part behind the dashboard that tries to really go into those impact kind of ways of museums operating.
Right. Thank you for that. Well, there's no dashboard behind the curtain, I will say that. And there's no question I don't arrogate to myself a place at Steve's level in the public conversation about the import of museums. He was the grandfather of us all in understanding how museum life needed to adapt and still needs to adapt to a public purpose. But I think in his research, he offered us the opportunity as his successors to look at qualitative measures, and there's very little qualitative measurement on what we've done. That's partly because it's very hard, as all of you know, and sociologists know and others who try to measure in ways that aren't indexed to statistics. Our point of view is to start here and recognize we've just started a quest, and the quest has to get to what you're talking about, which is the relevance of museums in people's lives and how they determine how important a museum is for them, both on a daily basis and as an experience in education and lifelong learning. And there's no question we haven't done that yet, but we're also not assigning ourselves that responsibility as a museum. I'd like to think that's a collective responsibility, and that simply by opening ourselves to transparency and revealing our processes, procedures, decisions, we create the opportunity for that kind of conversation. Because today, I would say, the way people approach the problem you've addressed is an instrumental answer, which is not complete. And it's to say, we matter to our communities because we preserve cultural heritage for the future. And yes, we know that, but tell us something in a deeper dimension and another level. And that's where we have to work towards. So I see this as a beginning point for institutional change. I don't see it as a solution to the very real issue you put on the table.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about you know, all of your experimentation with putting your content in other places like Facebook and YouTube and that sort of thing. We're all investing quite a bit of time and effort to try to do the same thing, you know, put our content out in the field where people are actually looking at it. But I'm not sure that we've really done very much about evaluating how that impacts our status, or, you know, do we count that as part of our impact? And I think if we were able to figure out how to do that, that we would see some tremendous, you know, numbers in ways that we don't know how to measure. Have you tried to do any of that kind of measurement, or do you plan to do that?
Well, I think we have a perspective about for-profit social networking sites, which is that they're for-profit and they may not be around in 5 years. So we don't want to invest all our eggs in a basket of a solution that's likely to be bought, sold, or merged, or disappear, if internally we can be thinking about what we need to do as an institution and begin to reveal that. And I don't say that to denigrate efforts that we and you are making in those sites, but if we put all of our focus on them, I think we probably are simply deflecting a responsibility and imagining that by doing that we've accomplished more than seconding to another entity the responsibility for that public conversation. So I think we have to find a way to both use those particular solutions, analyze the way in which participants, in terms of certainly the number of Facebook fans is the dumbest data you can gather. But as you begin to retrieve answers, you may find that multiple choice questions for people is an interesting way to go to get a response from a public that's in some way threaded and filtered. Because simply to track how many people are using Facebook on your museum site isn't useful. If you begin using surveys and polling information and begin to get real data back about things, I think that's instructive and helpful. And so that's certainly where we would like to go as well. There's a question back here.
I just want to let you know that R.J. Stein at your museum has provided the folks online, the 110 people watching online, with probably 15 links throughout your presentation, so he's backing you up. And Richard McCoy says he's happy to hear Max at your home chatting about SI transparency and mentioning conservation so often, so he's probably going to hit you up when you get back.
I have an image of a group of staff who are at their desktops or in an auditorium even more terrifyingly. So I thank you, Rob, for watching, and the whole team back in Indy. And I'll try to do a shout out to you too. Let's see here. Here we go. So yeah, I think part of the drama of that is in real time. Here we have someone communicating with a presentation in the public. And the rules haven't really changed, though, in our institutions. We're still print-focused media. The 400-page exhibition catalog is the thing that sells to 2 or 3% of our audience. You know, the legacy of all this hard work ends up as the doorstop, which we all worship and admire. I'm working on one right now that, with our curator of Spanish Baroque art, is publishing a majestic publication. But the behavior sets around what we do institutionally are still old school and print-based. And we haven't really figured out how, you know, a question from my chief information officer in real time to me standing at the Smithsonian, the Holy of Holies, it upsets the apple cart of authority and responsibility and the shared obligations that we have as museum professionals across a spectrum. And for most of the country, you probably forget because you work here, you are it. You are the Smithsonian. You are the record of history. You are the nation's attic. You're all these great things. And I don't think you're supposed to say nation's attic anymore. I just remembered. But I think the fascinating part about transparency is that it makes conversations possible across points of authority. It goes past the question of whether you're on a shelf in a bookstore or not. And it really opens up also in a kind of casual way the possibility for free exchange of ideas without as much fear. And that ultimately is only good for the life of mind, I would suggest.
Thanks for your inspiring talk. I was curious, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that there was some initial resistance to this attitude of transparency in your institution. I was wondering if you could tell us how you cultivated an acceptance of that in a practical way.
Thanks. Well, since I'm the director, I get to say something and then people actually listen to me, which is a great virtue of being a director. It's one of many. And no question, start with finances. Our CFO, Anne, are you watching? Who is an extremely talented master of our fortunes in finance. She also has a fiduciary responsibility to our Board of Governors and therefore ultimately to the Attorney General of the state of Indiana. And if something is wrong, it's ultimately her problem to deal with as well. So there are issues that are sensitive around what we do that clearly inform the more general resistance to opening up everything. And I think the question at the IMA today is not what goes on the dashboard. That's now a reflex. It's now that we've done this deaccessioning module, it's, well, what is there that's sacred beyond individual medical histories? I guess that's really what's left, because the other issues that we have out and about are open for scrutiny. And if you think about the new Form 990 that the IRS has delivered to all of us to fill out, it has a lot more revelations about how I spend my time and how much money I get for travel and expenses, and it reveals a lot more information in ways that heretofore were considered embarrassing, and today it's about a marketplace. And museums are in a marketplace. I hope it's a marketplace of ideas more than it is of dollars. But the feeling of our staff is that I think that they've gotten past the initial hurdle of recognizing that revealing that we're not the top museum in point X, Y, or Z is okay. And what it allows you to do is to improve upon that performance. So I think that was the real revelation for people, that at first it's very difficult to be under that scrutiny potentially, especially when people are blogging about you in the Netherlands and you're going, I didn't know we mattered there. I thought we were a US institution and at best, and perhaps more a city museum. So I think that's what changed the mindset of our colleagues around the museum. We may be running out of gas here, I don't know.
Hello, hi. I would like to know, from your point of view, why there is I don't know, if there is a need in the museum sector of statistic and sharing of data, and why, you said before, there is no possibility to publish some data concerning museum.
Non so se ho capito la domanda. Si può andare in italiano, benissimo.
No, why in the museum sector is there is not the possibility or to find statistics. For instance, I try to do for research to find more data about museum, and I try to see the American Museum Association and the American Art Museum Director.
Right.
But I didn't find a lot of data, so I wonder why it's
Yeah.
so difficult to find.
Right. Well, I think the furtive behavior, the secretive behavior of people who do what I do for a living is just an inherited fact that we have been brought up to believe that we run institutions which are for the public good. That's obvious. Game over. And as long as we're not fostering moral turpitude, what's the problem? So there's no impetus, there's no pressure on museums to reveal information until the new Form 990 appeared in 2008-9. There's no reward system for revealing statistics. There's no obligation, generally, apart from on your tax return. So if you have not spent time on guidestar.org, I don't know if you've been to that website, you can search every nonprofit in the country and look at all their tax returns and all the money they spend on this, that, and the other. But it's a very blunt instrument. It doesn't give you what you're asking for. But I think the culture of nonprofits is to assume that we're wonderful, why don't people love us, and not feel the need to prove it. And when that amendment came to the language linking us to casinos and golf courses, it should have been, a call to arms to say, now we've really got to get our act together to explain who we are, what we do, who we serve, what value we bring to their lives. And statistics is just part of that, as you were observing. It's just the beginning point.
I'm wondering what your director colleagues think of your experiment at Indianapolis.
Well, I've been a member of the Association of Art Museum Directors for a while, and I think my curiosity about technology began a while back, and they tolerated me when I said, why don't we set up a listserv in 1993? And we had 6 directors who had email at the time, so it was a very lively listserv, as you can imagine. So they've tolerated me with graciousness and forgiveness for many years. And I think we're at the point where, because of the public scrutiny that's bearing down on institutions, largely from what we've done, but also from our failure to describe how well we do things, there's a growing sense of urgency about this kind of approach. And I don't assume that the IMA is the place that has to be developing the next object registry. I mean, the hope is, and Michael Govan at LA County and I were talking recently about how he has an idea around the deaccessioning approach that could really be exciting and powerful as a means of moving forward. So all of us in the association are working on these issues, and all of us are committed to rethinking how we open ourselves up as institutions. But I think you'll see a lot more of that, happily, in the weeks and months to come. And I think with that, I may have overstayed my welcome. I'll be around afterwards for a question, and I so appreciate your putting in the time to be with us today. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for coming today and for the remarks. And I hope that for many of you that joined us today, if you check back or tell your colleagues about it, it will be archived. This session, along with others, previous presentations to the Good Lecture Series, will be on museumstudies.si.edu, so you can go back and look at it again. In closing, I'd just like to mention, yesterday I happened to be at an education meeting, and the President of the United States made a surprise visit. And bear with me, because probably never again in my life will I be able to say when I was at a meeting yesterday with the President. But at that meeting, what he said is, most of it was about transparency. Now, he was talking to heads of education in the 50 states about the billions of dollars that are coming to them through the pipeline and the responsibility they bear for that. But he really was speaking much more broadly about government being transparent and how we're going to build trust and how we're going to be accountable for those funds. And so in that point, his discussions were targeted towards those educators. It was clear his vision is much broader than that. And so that makes your talk today even more relevant for us to start to think about, although at this point we're not getting those billions, how are we documenting what we do and making our case? So thank you for leading